Hello and welcome to the GameCraft Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Lasky.
I'm Blake Robbins.
And this is a limited series about the history of the video game business. Episode 3, The Calculus of Fun.
How casual games went from a budding industry to dominating all of gaming.
In this episode, we're going to be talking broadly about the mobile business, and just as a byproduct of that, we're also going to talk about the casual business because it's really hard to talk about one without the other. The casual business is so intertwined with the mobile business over the 20-year period that we're going to be talking about.
Mitch, I'm excited for this one. Mobile is obviously an area that you and I talk a lot about, primarily actually through the lens of advertising and analytics. It's super interesting to think about, what role maybe analytics played back in those days. Like, what was casual games like in the earliest days? Because I have no idea what the earliest casual games are. In my mind, it might be Pac-Man or something like that, or the arcade games. What role did analytics play? Did it play any role at that time?
Actually, it played a really important role, and there's a really interesting story to be told about this because I think the casual games business owes a lot to a really unlikely hero. There was a man named Robert Westmoreland who was really the champion of the casual games business and in a lot of ways created the world we currently live in, where the mobile casual business represents roughly half of the video game industry. That wasn't always the case, and in a lot of ways we owe that to Robert Westmoreland. So who was this guy? Robert Westmoreland, he started his career back in the late 80s in Texas, and he was working at the series of now forgotten retailers like Computer City and Babbage's and places like that, people my age remember, but that are sort of lost to the sands of time. And he was a thing called a buyer. And in the retail speak of the packaged goods era, a buyer was basically a guy who acts as sort of a membrane between the publishers and the consumers. So he worked for the retailer, but he basically looked at what the publishers' catalogs were and tried to understand what his audience wanted, and then would buy the product from the publishers in enough quantity to fulfill the demand that was being generated by his customers. So that was the function of the buyer. So buyers were pretty important, right? Because they were kind of at this nexus between supply and demand, and they were gatekeeping in a lot of ways what products were getting into retail. So in 1995, Westmoreland moves to Walmart, the giant retailer, and joins the big box retailers who were now kind of muscling their way into this market. Back before 1995, really, computer software retailing had been the domain of kind of mom and pop shops and some of these small regional retailers. But starting in 95, I think the big box retailers really saw the opportunity. And so Walmart, Target, Best Buy, other companies like that started to kind of get into this market. And Walmart hired Westmoreland as their video game buyer. So Westmoreland comes in, and at Walmart, Walmart is a big retailing operation, right? They're everywhere. They're maybe the largest in the United States. Probably, now Amazon is bigger, but in terms of brick and mortar, they're probably the largest retailer in the United States. So he's there, and as the buyer for games at Walmart, he's got access to unbelievable data from all of these stores all over the United States. And he's looking at the sales data, and he starts noticing something really interesting, which is among the best-selling games that Walmart has on their shelves, sure, they included things like Warcraft and Command and Conquer and MechWarrior, the things that the big publishers were pushing into retail in that era. But he also saw that there was this other kind of game, this more casual, more accessible, less expensive game that was also doing really, really well.
Okay, so he's looking at all this data. What does he actually do? Does he create a game? Does he actually do anything with that?
Westmoreland was a really ambitious guy, and he, armed with all of this data that suggested that there was this underserved market for cheaper, more casual games, he goes to GT Interactive. GT Interactive is a publisher we talked about in episode 1. They had the id Software rights for Doom and Quake, and so they were well known to the big box retailers. Westmoreland goes and he commissions GT to create a game for the casual audience. And GT, interestingly, had just acquired this small publisher called WizardWorks. And they were going to do a line of these lower priced games. At the time, there were these things that were called 5x10 packs. They're ridiculous. It's almost like you were selling bubble gum or trading cards, but you would buy 10 CD-ROMs in a thing that hung on a single tag, and it was 5 feet long, the packaging. So it was a ludicrous packaging thing, but it was a way to take extra shelf space and turn it into something that they could make money on. And basically they were recycling bargain bin titles that had maybe failed and they were remaindered. And so the publishers just had these discs lying around and they would basically give them to Walmart so they could be put into these 5-foot-10 packs. So that was a thing. And so GT had gone out thinking, oh, we're going to get into this market. And they'd bought this company called WizardWorks. And WizardWorks took the Walmart commission and they went and found this tiny little publisher in Indiana called Sunstorm, and they gave him $125,000. And Sunstorm came up with this game called Deer Hunter. Deer Hunter, again, in those days, it was like a shooting gallery game. It was basically like as simplistic and nonsensical as the Carney games where the ducks are on the little mechanical thing and you're shooting them with the air gun. It was that lame. Despite the ridicule of everybody, myself included at the time, who, when we first looked at it at Activision, we were like, this is barely a game. The thing just blew up. And Westmoreland knew exactly what he was doing. And he basically got this thing on the shelves at Walmart on an exclusive basis in 1997, and it sold millions and millions of units.
It's a perfect example of what we were talking about at the beginning, where data-driven decision-making is such a key part of the mobile games business now, or what we know as the casual games business. But this has to be one of the first examples of someone looking at the data and actually getting it right.
It's hard to describe how shocking it was at the time, because you got to remember we were coming out of an era in the video game business when the video game designer developer was really considered an artist. I mean, it goes back to Electronic Arts' famous like "We See Farther" advertisement with the moody black and white that they took of their quote unquote software artists who, you know, were all looking very artistic there in their designery garb. And it just blew that whole myth out of the water. I mean, 1997 was the year, as we just talked about in episode 1, when John Romero was getting Ion Storm started, and he was literally positioning himself as a rock star. And yet here, one of the biggest games of the year was created on commission by a suit at Walmart who had gone to a B-level publisher who themselves went to a C-level developer to just churn out this product that they knew there was a market for because they had the data.
It's a perfect example of, even to this day, where people don't really look at mobile maybe as seriously as they do the hardcore games. But it turns out everybody is a gamer. And they clearly identified that at that time, where there was a massively underserved audience. And that's just incredible.
It really woke the industry up in a remarkable way, because other things were happening around that time, but everybody just looked at them as one-offs, right? I mean, Mattel had Barbie's Fashion Designer back in 1996, which did really, really well. But people were like, oh, it's Barbie, you know, it's a one-off, it's not replicable, whatever. And Hasbro had taken some of their board game properties and started putting them onto the computer. And again, they were doing really, really well with these products. But again, people were kind of brushing them off, and it's like, oh, that's not serious. That's not really the computer games business. But when Deer Hunter blew up, that really got everybody's attention.
So what happens after that? Do they continue to replicate that, or do a bunch of people start copying? How soon after do we start to see the rise of casual games?
Probably the most important part of the casual games story in the late 90s was how it harmonized or didn't harmonize with what the executives in these video game companies were telling Wall Street. So you had a bunch of public video game publishers, Activision, Electronic Arts, and others, and they had been pointing at the future growth of the video game business. Frankly, given what's happened to the video game business, I don't think they could have even imagined how much the video game business grew in those days. But they were always saying to the Wall Street analysts, hey, this is going to be a mass market business. Everybody's a gamer. You're going to see this sort of layering of audience as the older generation continues to play games and the younger generation is born playing games. And it sounded really good to the Wall Street analysts who could look at their 5 to 10 year projections for these stocks and really compound the value of these companies. But in reality, these publishers, and I can speak from experience since I was there running one of these studios, we were doing very little to serve an audience outside of the core. And when we finally saw things like Deer Hunter and Barbie's Fashion Designer and the Hasbro games come to market and really blow doors, we had to do something. We had to respond. So at Activision, we went off and we acquired this Minneapolis company called Head Game Software that had a relationship with Best Buy. and we started to make casual games. We licensed Cabela's, the big hunting retailer. So we did a clone of Deer Hunter called Cabela's Big Game Hunter. And, Electronic Arts in 1997, 1998 was driven to acquire Maxis, who at the time was kind of on the edge between being a casual game company and being a core game company. They had things like SimCity and others. This was pre-The Sims. This was, back in the SimCity days. So they acquired that company back in 1997 and started to, again, make games that were designed more for a mass market perspective. And so really by the end of that decade, by 1999, the whole market had kind of flipped. There were only 3 of the top-selling PC games by units that were traditional core games in 1999. 7 of the top 10 were either children's games or fully casual games. And that included Deer Hunter 3. So it was already on its 3rd sequel. So that's where we ended up. That's where we were in 1999. And that's the change in the casual games business that was really initiated by Robert Westmoreland's ability to study the data at Walmart and to understand that the audience for games was way bigger than the audience that the traditional publishers really imagined.
Yeah, I've never heard that story before, but it's one of those things where it's so clear in hindsight that the gaming market was much bigger. Like you said, the Wall Street story of everybody's a gamer, but clearly the incumbents weren't actually acting on that until you have a buyer at Walmart actually act on that, which is absolutely incredible. Obviously, the analytics and data-driven side of this is one piece. We now know, we're privileged to know in 2022, that mobile plays a huge role in this. At what point do we start to see casual and mobile blend?
Well, obviously, you had this phenomenon going on the PC side, and Microsoft even understood this on a certain level. I mean, Windows came bundled with Minesweeper and Solitaire. So the idea that casual games were viable should have been obvious, really, given the success of those products. But in some ways, the PC was still kind of a geeky thing. I mean, yeah, it was going more mass market. The internet was driving it into people's homes. But remember that between 1995 and 1999, PC gaming was still a little bit of a fringe phenomenon in the larger sense of things. Consoles were still way more important in that era and the like. So in a lot of ways, casual games was a big market kind of in search of a platform. And mobile was the perfect platform. And the marriage between casual gaming and mobile is so obvious in retrospect. So the story, I guess, of casual gaming moves from the Midwest, where Robert Westmoreland was plying his trade down in Arkansas, where Walmart is headquartered, and heads across the Atlantic Ocean, really to the Nordic countries, and in particular to Finland, where Nokia, the cell phone manufacturer, is getting ready to take the world over with mobile technology.
The early cell phone days for me, I was barely even born at the time, but I remember Nokia playing a huge role at that time. I'm curious to hear where this story goes.
So Nokia, was a big conglomerate. It had been around for like 150 years. One of these sort of old companies that found a new market. They were making a lot of traditional telecom equipment stuff. And they saw this opportunity in mobile, and they had a real sense of that Nordic design. Starting, I think, all the way back in the mid-90s, like 93, 94, they'd come out with these candy bar phones, like the famous 2110, which was one of these iconic phones that you see it and you immediately understand it as a Nokia product. So that started to happen back then. And then around the middle of the decade, they came out with the 6110, which, for those of us who were in the mobile business, and we'll get to that part of the story because I spent a long time in the mobile business, the 6110 was really a transformative product because unlike any phone before it, it included a really good processor. It included a 32-bit ARM processor. And so for the first time, you could actually run legit software in a mobile phone. Now, obviously at the time, that quote unquote legit software was pretty much just a shitty calendar application or your contacts for making your mobile phone calls or your text messages, et cetera. But the potential was there in the phone for more. So that leads us to the second hero of this story. We've already learned about Robert Westmoreland, the Walmart buyer who kind of initiated the casual games business here in the United States and on the PC. There was a similar character at Nokia who's gone unnoticed for all of these years, much like Robert Westmoreland, and that is Tanieli Armanto. Who was this guy? So Tanieli Armanto was the guy who did Snake on the Nokia phone, created the game that was maybe played more than any other game in history. because that game shipped on every single handset that Nokia created that was capable of running software like it.
The Nokia 6110, if I remember correctly, is that the candy bar like blue one? Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Oh my gosh. I think I even had one of those. It was probably 7 or 8 years old at that point when I finally got my phone. But my gosh, I remember playing Snake at that time.
So yeah, they brought in Tanyeli, who was part of this group that was going to design all of these new applications for this new 32-bit ARM processor, right? They were going to update all of their internals for these calendaring programs, et cetera, for the 6110. And they asked him, hey, maybe we'll do a game. So he went off. He found this kind of public domain play pattern, the Snake play pattern, in which the snake moves around, this little pixelated snake moves around, and as it eats the little dots, it grows in length, and therefore the constraints of moving it around the screen become greater and greater the longer it gets. Very, very simple play pattern, very addictive, very repeatable. He got to work and he built this game, basically, and it was preloaded on 350 million handsets.
Oh
so
gosh.
really, in a way here, casual gaming found the platform, and Snake was that game that sort of married the two of them together. And the poor guy really never received a whole lot of credit for this. He was interviewed, I remember, maybe 10 years later when they were doing the 10th anniversary of the 6110 as a kind of a corporate PR fest. And they name-checked him in a press release or whatever. And he worked at Nokia for like 15, 16 years, right? Like just he was a lifer. But he, in many ways, was the father of mobile gaming.
I had never heard of him prior to this. And honestly, it's a travesty that we don't know about him because he did play such a critical role. And I think even more importantly, Snake, it was a perfect game for the mobile phone. To his credit, he discovered a play pattern that was perfect for that screen at that time. And those lessons are still, we learn from that and of embracing the medium.
It's so true. Nokia was not blind to this, and they saw how popular Snake was on the handsets, and they went on kind of a tour and went to talk to a bunch of the game's publishers, including Activision. So they showed up in the late 90s at Activision, and we took a meeting with them, and they pitched us on this idea of making more sophisticated games for the mobile phones. At the time, these were very conservative. I mean, we were dragged kicking and screaming into the casual business, let alone into the mobile business. So while we were polite and we listened, nobody really had the wherewithal to divert resources from our core games into doing these mobile games. But there was an executive who was working at Activision who was working for me in the studio named Scott Lehman. And Scott Lehman was in on those meetings early on, was listening to the pitch from Nokia, and was kind of doing his own research on this whole mobile phone thing. And he got really, really excited about it. By 2000, he quit his job at Activision and he joined a business incubator called eCompanies. And he started working on a startup mobile game company. And that mobile game company went on to become Jamdat. Jamdat was a company that I then became the CEO of later and was the first large-scale mobile game company to go public on NASDAQ and really was one of the defining companies in that early era of mobile, that pre-iPhone era of mobile.
What actually gave you the conviction at that time to leave Activision, this great role, to chase mobile games? Again, this is pre-iPhone. We're really at Nokia times or the handset time. What gave you conviction at that point?
Obviously, seeing my colleagues get really excited about it was important. Seeing the Nokia executives come over and pitch us was really important. But for me, the real catalyzing event was the 1999 Tokyo Game Show. I went to the Tokyo Game Show, as I did every year, to meet with the various console manufacturers because the Japanese still were dominating the industry. The Xbox wouldn't launch until the next year, so it was the first really domestic console that made a real impact on the business. But up until that time, it was all Japan, Sega, Sony, Nintendo, et cetera. So I was over there to kiss the ring, if you will, of the people who were putting food on the plate. In addition, we were still in the biz dev mode of going over to acquire hot titles that we thought that were centered in Japan, but if we could westernize them a bit, we could sell them in Western markets. And so I was also there in a biz dev role. But I always, because I'm a curious guy, I always used to reserve some time at the end of the show, the Sunday morning of the last day of the show, to go around and look at what was happening in the cheap booths, what was happening outside of the main hall where the big publishers were present. And in that year, and in previous years, I had done this. I'd gone to see the weird stuff that proliferates in the Japanese market that's never makes it to the Western market, things like girlfriend simulators and strange anime titles that just, were never translated, these very text-heavy RPGs, et cetera, et cetera. And I would go and I would politely look at this. In 99, I go to look at the cheap booths, and it's all cell phone games. So in that year, NTT Docomo, which was one of the big three Japanese cell phone operators, they had released this service called iMode. And iMode was basically a data service on top of their mobile phones. And they had released these incredible phones with color screens, high-speed data. They could play games. They could do all kinds of sophisticated things. And a bunch of little developers had started making games for the new cell phone culture. And in that year, in 99, all the booths were filled with these new cell phone games. And it really, again, knowing that Japan was always 20 minutes into the future, right? They were always anticipating the next trends in the video game business. Seeing this really, really sparked my imagination.
I know the story only through our conversations, but you return back from that trip. How quickly after do you leave and actually decide to join Jamdat?
So within 6 months of the Tokyo Game Show, I'd quit my job as head of studios at Activision, which was kind of insane at that point. It was one of the best jobs in the video game business. And I went to E-Companies, which had just formed a joint venture between Sprint PCS and themselves. And Sprint PCS was basically going to get them to start making games for this new mobile internet that was on the horizon. And remember, this is just before the internet crash of 2000, 2001. So I showed up in mid-2000. I took over the incubator as the general manager of the incubator, and really it was my first foray into venture capital in some way. And I started looking around, and one of the things that was already in the incubator was this company that was codenamed Athens. God knows why. It was Scott Lehman and a couple of other friends from Activision who were working there on this mobile game company. And at first I was thinking this was my chance to escape from the games business for a while and go and look at this larger mobile internet business. But slowly but surely it became clear that Jamdat was going to be viable. And we decided that it would make sense for me to take over as CEO. Scott remained as head of studios, and we spun the thing out of the incubator, and we went out and tried to raise capital for it in January of 2001. Not a great time to be out looking for money, but we were able to get it funded. We had a terrific group of investors during that period. Alan Patrickov was one of our early patrons, and later we got money from Qualcomm, from Sprint itself, from Sun Microsystems, which was a very viable and important company back in that era, kind of lost again to time, and Intel.
Wow.
And so all of those companies were betting on a mobile future, and they saw games as an important part of it. Yeah, so we got started in earnest in early 2001.
And then obviously we know how that story goes, where mobile phones start to take off in the West. And I imagine that also means mobile gaming starts to take off. What were those early games? What did they look like? Just so I understand.
They were incredibly primitive. I mean, we had very low-res screens. We had very limited keyboard inputs. In fact, the name Jamdat itself is a phone number. If you look on an old-fashioned phone that has, the 3 letters for the T9 typing that you used to have to do when you were sending text messages with double and triple tapping of keys, we wanted a name that was easily typable into a mobile phone in case we ever had to get you to go directly to a URL, for example. So Jamdat is all initial key presses. It can be actually typed with 6 presses. So those were the constraints we were operating under, where even our name had to be constrained in order to operate on a mobile phone because text entry was so poor. That was the world of mobile gaming. So we made things like Jamdat Bowling. We made a game called Gladiator that was incredibly popular. That was literally just a rock, paper, scissors game, for lack of a better word. But it was multiplayer, and you could play it over the really, really crappy internet that was available on mobile networks back in those days.
Obviously, you just talked about how Jamdat goes public. Was that 2004?
2001, we get started. 2002, we start having conversations with Qualcomm and with Sun Microsystems because they're about to bring 2 really important technologies to market. So Qualcomm had a thing called Brew, which they were using, again, in these unintended consequences, they were using as a software loader to update firmware on their chips. And they realized that they could also upload actual applications using the same technology. So they productized this thing called Brew into a platform, and it allowed us to have a little coding area that we could launch games on. Similarly, at the same time, Sun Microsystems was working on this thing called Java Micro Edition, J2ME. And J2ME was a companion technology that was available on, phones outside of the United States primarily. Those two technologies really, they were kind of our PlayStation and our Xbox in those really early days of the mobile games business. And so we were able to use them as platforms. We still had a absolutely nightmarish task of making these games work across this incredibly broad array of mobile handsets. There was no standardization by any stretch. We would just weep when we think about the iPhone and the dominance of the iPhone in the current market, where you had this single device that you could code towards. I think the last year that we were an independent company in 2006, we did something like 200,000 distinct software sales units to account for all of the various linguistic screen sizes, keypad orientations, et cetera, et cetera. If you took like a single game of ours, and we only had 30 games. So you needed to do something like 7,000 versions of every game.
That is absolutely insane.
It is insane.
I mean, there's so many stories I can only imagine from that time, because you don't even have app stores at that point. You're in these early days. How are you even distributing at that point?
So the carriers all had these. They were basically just lists of games. And we very early understood that those lists were important customer acquisition vehicles, because people would gravitate towards looking at those lists when they were making a decision about what they might want to play. So we were very aggressive about pushing our products onto those lists, forming deals with the carriers to guarantee that some of our products would appear above the fold on some of those lists. And really doing some very early channel marketing, if you will, which, has obviously become incredibly important in the world of e-commerce over the years. But in those days, it was very primitive. And to your point about the app stores, I'm not proud of this fact, but I will say that the 70-30 split that we're now living with on all of the mobile platforms, Apple, litigating literally to preserve the 70-30 split, was the product of a meeting between me and Paul Palmieri, who was running Verizon's gaming initiative at that time, and a Qualcomm representative, when we were talking about what kind of revenue share we were going to be able to accommodate. And, Verizon was basically like, look, we're going to play the role of the retailer. And as a retailer, we expect that we're going to acquire customers for you. And our positioning on these mobile lists, et cetera, these game lists, are going to be very important to you. And we deserve to get 30% of the revenue in exchange for acquiring these customers for you and basically propagating this platform to millions and millions of users. And you know what? And in those days where there were no viable advertising channels, that was a good deal. And we agreed to it. And ironically, when Steve Jobs releases the iPhone several years later, he points to the Verizon and AT&T app stores at the time as precedent for justification for the 30-70 split that we're living with today.
That's incredible. And also, I think a lot of people listening to this might not be happy that that was how this precedent forms. But I think it speaks to, again, the whole thesis of this entire podcast is there's these small business decisions that get made that end up shaping this entire industry.
Yeah, we were literally in a Vietnamese restaurant called Le Colonial in San Francisco, and we sketched it on the back of a proverbial napkin while we were having cocktails. I mean, that was how this happened. And as cliche and silly as it sounds, 25 years later, it's the world we live in.
Yeah, I mean, that deal probably makes a lot more sense, like you said, just purely off of, it was almost a channel partnership at that point where you were preloaded or you were available on that screen. So, I mean, obviously today there's so many debates over how that split is formed.
So it's interesting because, this thing blew up, and between, we raised our Series B in 2002, was a massive struggle, and Qualcomm kind of came to our rescue. And then Benchmark, my ultimate employer many years later, came and did the Series C. And by September of 2004, same month as Google, we went public. Close to $1 billion valuation, when $1 billion valuation meant something. And, we're generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. We acquired the rights to Tetris. We acquired the rights to Bejeweled. So we had a really interesting collection of casual games, and we were selling millions and millions of units through this. So I think, if you were paying attention, you could see that there was this massive, massive market for mobile games. And, you started to see the first smartphones coming out in 2005 with bigger screens, touch screens. This was the era of the BlackBerry and the Handspring and some of these other kinds of, PDA type devices. And so there were a really interesting proliferation of new platforms. And in 2005, we get a really strange call. So we get a call from Tony Fadell, who at the time was was working on a bunch of stealth projects at Apple, but in particular, he's the father of the iPod.
Yep.
And he invites us to come up to Apple and talk about putting games on the iPod. And so this was 2005. So we're talking 2.5 years before the introduction of the iPhone.
Wow.
And we go up to Cupertino. We actually had to buy a Mac laptop because we were told, do not try and present at Apple with a PC. So we went up to Apple. We bought a Mac laptop. We go up and we give them a presentation with some ideas that we had spitballed about games that we could make, rhythm-based music games, for example, like Guitar Hero or Dance Dance Revolution that we could potentially do on an iPad, musical games, and others, and other games that might be susceptible to the click wheel that was prevalent on those early iPods, the big white ones with the big wheel, if you remember them.
Yep.
And so we met with them, and we thought the meeting had gone pretty well. But on the way out, Tony and his team basically said, don't call us, we'll call you. For us, that was like the kiss of death. So we sort of put our tail between our legs, and we went back to LA from Cupertino, and we didn't hear from them for like a year.
Wow.
Like a year later, we get a call, and they're like, okay, we're ready for those games now, after having not talked to us for an entire year. So we trundle back up to Cupertino, and we sort of hash out what we could do on short notice, because they're like, look, we're going to launch a store for the iPod with applications, and we want your games in that store. And so we rushed and we threw some things together and we created some games. And when they launched that store in September of 2006, we somehow had 4 of the 8 launch titles. So we were half the market for iPod games when they first came out. It didn't work. It didn't sell very well. People didn't really grok the idea of buying games for their iPods. Nevertheless, little did we know that this was just basically a trial balloon for the iPhone and the App Store. We were the guinea pigs.
Oh my gosh, what an incredible story. I mean, we talked about Tonelli and we talked about Robert Westmoreland, and it feels like in a lot of ways, you're actually one of the godfathers of casual gaming here.
I would say really kind of more the business nerd, but I would say Scott Lehman and Zach Norman, who ran the studio at Jamdat, deserve the credit. They were the pioneers.
That's absolutely incredible. To have 4 of the 8 on the initial iPod is just absolutely insane. And obviously, we know how this plays out, where I imagine, is it a year later that the iPhone comes out?
Pretty much. So, we sold the company. Electronic Arts came in and acquired us for like $680 million in the end of 2006. Wow. And so by 2007, early 2007, I was an EA employee. And in January of 2007, Steve Jobs announces the iPhone at Macworld, which still existed back in those days in San Francisco. And it was, it's still to this day one of, it's a great rewatch to go back and watch.
I've watched it many times. Yeah, it's incredible.
It's really incredible. And it's really incredible also because you could see the world that we were coming from and the glimmers of the world we were heading towards, because a lot of that iPhone announcement is about telephony, right? It's about making phone calls, right? I mean, you're part of this next generation. You're a millennial. You don't make phone calls. You never call me, right?
Yeah.
You just text message me. It's like my own children. They never answer the phone when I call them. And then I call them and they text me back.
Exactly.
So it's really funny to watch that Steve Jobs video through that prism, because he was really foregrounding things like, visual voicemail. Like, who cares about visual voicemail? It was like a big deal in that initial iPhone announcement.
Yeah, obviously, we now know that games became such a huge part of the iPhone. When the iPhone initially comes out, I think I had the first version of the iPhone. I remember there were games like Doodle Jump or these like really simple casual games. It doesn't feel like it fully explodes at that point, but what ends up happening?
Well, there's no third-party software really on launch, right? It's just the Apple software that's available on the phone on launch, and that persisted for some time. It really wasn't until a while later, I think 18 months later, that the iPhone opens up to third-party apps through the App Store. And even then, the App Store was very much like the app stores on the Verizon and AT&T phones, where they were single download, paid download. We were selling games for $2.99 or whatever on Verizon. And that was really the same kind of model that was carried over to the initial App Store. So games were viable. People were making them and selling them. Obviously, the screen and the chip and all of the infrastructure on the iPhone was just significantly better than on the feature phones. And so it was obviously hinted at an amazing platform for games in the future. But the commercial model of paid download was still a little bit full of friction in terms of its ability to really enable a casual games business that could be as mass market as the iPhone really suggested. And so it really wasn't until really October of 2009 when finally Apple got around to announcing the concept of in-app purchase, where you could allow someone to download something for free and then pay for it once they decided that they liked it, that you really saw this market take off. And in a lot of ways, it wasn't the introduction of the iPhone in 2007. It was the introduction of in-app purchase in 2009 that catalyzed the video game market on mobile phones.
I can't just emphasize that enough. It wasn't actually the iPhone that truly changed the mobile gaming industry. It was the introduction of the in-app purchase. And that makes so much sense in hindsight. But again, it goes back to the first episode where free-to-play completely changes everything. And with Apple playing a role as a platform, maybe not a platform-based publisher, they did have all of these credit cards. They had aggregated all the demand there. It plays this amazing role to just completely unlock free-to-play mobile gaming.
Yeah, I mean, free-to-play really found its home in mobile and in the App Store. Because you had this pattern where children, or adults in fact, would download a bunch of different games for free. They would play each of them for 15 or 20 seconds just to see if they were fun. And then they would keep playing the one that they liked. And as they continued to play it more and more, they were incentivized to pay for it, to buy extra lives, to buy extra cosmetic items, to buy extra gear, whatever it was that would, enhance their gameplay. And so that model, that addiction model of mobile, became incredibly important, and it would never have happened without in-app purchase, because without in-app purchase, you could never have done free-to-play. And it was free-to-play, as we discussed in our first episode, that really opened this market up.
Is it fair to assume that the incumbents, like in the packaged good free-to-play era, struggled or had innovators' dilemma? Do we see the same thing play out here, where you were at EA at the time? Were you slow to adopt free-to-play in this context?
So I had left EA already to go to Benchmark in 2008. So I wasn't around for the move to in-app purchase, unfortunately. But my colleagues, I think, unfortunately didn't get it. And they continued to try and sell very high-priced games. I mean, EA was selling a version of John Madden Football the year of in-app purchase's release in 2009 for $14.99, right? One of the highest priced products in the App Store. Other than maybe, esoteric productivity software. That was pretty much it. So a $15 SKU. Again, people wouldn't even pay $15 for things on Steam today. And yet they were trying to create a premium price point for software, utterly misunderstanding how that market was going and just how free-to-play had transformed it. I mean, this was right around the same time that I was having my initial meetings with Riot Games. So it was already clear that free-to-play was an important vector in the video game business. And it was clear for something that we're going to really need to talk about a little bit now, and that was the casual game explosion on Facebook.
All I know when you say Facebook casual gaming is I think of immediately just Farmville. That just took over my life and so many of my friends' lives. Is that what you're referring to?
Absolutely. And, I don't like to use the term social gaming because in a lot of ways, what was happening on Facebook with the early Zynga games and Playfish games and some of the others was distinctly antisocial. But let's call it social games because that's what everybody else calls it. But yes, starting around that same time, around 2006, you had these titles like Farmville that were showing up on Facebook and they were just exploding. And, you had companies like Zynga, they'd come from making other casual games. They had a Texas Hold'em poker game that I remember early on. And in 2009, they put out Farmville, and it goes from 0 to like 20 million active users pretty much overnight and starts raking in the cash.
Everyone was playing Farmville. I was, call it 15 or 16 at that time. And I just remember my entire Facebook just being pure Farmville spam. Like the notifications constantly were just go and play, like take care of your farm.
Yeah, we'll come back to the notification stuff because that's really important to the part of the story that's about customer acquisition and analytics, because that played a really important role in Facebook's turning a blind eye to this customer acquisition spam that Zynga was engaged in is a really important part of this story because it ends up in some weird areas if you play it out to the end, and we'll get there. But Zynga really understood deeply the virality of Facebook and the nature of the feed, the Facebook feed. They went on a 3-year run between 2009 and their IPO in 2011 that was pretty much one of the most remarkable in the history of the video game business. I mean, at the time of the IPO, Zynga had 54 million dailies and 227 million monthly active users, which is astonishing, really, by any measure. And they'd grown revenues from like 20 million in 2008 to $1 billion in 2011, right? So this was just explosive growth of a kind we hadn't really ever seen before. This was before Riot and League of Legends, when that would ultimately get to these levels. But this was a really early echo of what was going to happen later in the core PC business. Look, they were not popular. Critics hated it. Like with Robert Westmoreland, when he was bringing Deer Hunter to market, there were people in the core business who looked at Zynga and thought it was not a games company. But it was the focus on the dark engagement patterns on Facebook that people really had a problem with. I think there was nothing wrong with Farmville. It's a perfectly fine game and it's a perfectly fine play pattern. But it was the spam and some of these dark patterns around engagement to kind of incentivize you to put your achievements on the timeline so that your friends would see what you were doing, et cetera, and then hopefully join in, where they really kind of started to get in trouble.
Yeah, it almost felt like Facebook and Zynga at the time were like married. It felt like when you would go on your newsfeed or you'd go and check your notifications, they were one and the same. It felt like Zynga took over Facebook at some point.
And it's not just the appearance. I mean, when Facebook went public later, Zynga was 12% of their revenue. They had to disclose it in their S1 because of the dependency. I mean, it was that material. You were not seeing it wrongly. You were seeing it correctly. They were really important. They were joined at the hip in a very fundamental way. And so Facebook really was incentivized to look the other way largely and to allow some of these dark engagement patterns to persist.
I'm assuming that happened primarily because Facebook didn't have their dominant ad business at the time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was really before Facebook kind of became the behemoth in the direct response advertising that we know it is today. And so I'm sure they learned a lot from the experience of Zynga in terms of how to structure this. But yes, you're right.
What happens to Zynga, right? You have Farmville, you have this hit. It seems like Facebook eventually responds and on some level. But what happens to Zynga in this whole story?
So they have a really interesting trajectory. So they go public in 2011. They run up to like a $7 billion valuation. Actually, they go out at a $7 billion valuation. They run up beyond the $7 billion valuation. And everybody is celebrating who were shareholders of Zynga or who were fans of the social casual game market. But they came back down to earth very hard because right around the time that they went public, Facebook started to really change their tune in terms of the role that they wanted to play in the gaming business. I mean, up until that point, they had kind of let it be a bit of a laissez-faire environment for games companies that wanted to come in and utilize distribution through the feed. But starting in around 2012, the year after Zynga goes public, Facebook starts really changing their tune. And they decide that they want to be more of a customer acquisition vehicle through direct response advertising off the feed. Then they really want that feed spam to start proliferating in a way that would ruin the customer experience for people on Facebook. And that change really affects Zynga dramatically, and their market cap falls. At one point within the subsequent couple of years, they're trading at roughly the enterprise value of their cash and the building that they owned in downtown San Francisco. So they fell on pretty hard times. But ultimately, they were able to kind of pull it out. I mean, Zynga has recently been sold to Take-Two. And, that was a deal that occurred at a multiple of the low point. And I think a lot of the credit goes to Frank Gibeau. Frank was a colleague of mine at Electronic Arts back in 2007. He was the head of marketing when I was there. And Frank took over Zynga as the third CEO after Don Matrick, another EA veteran, and then obviously Mark Pincus, the founder. And Frank really brought it back to life. He was a methodical, intelligent guy who just did a yeoman's job there and really got value for the shareholders at the end of the day. But it was a tough slog, and it took a long time to bring that company back.
Primarily, that company ends up becoming much more of a mobile casual business rather than a social business.
In fact, yes. Today, you would think of Zynga really more as a mobile game company.
So as Zynga goes public and eventually, as we now know, sells to Take-Two, Facebook still plays a role despite moving into direct response advertising.
Yeah, Facebook kind of got out of the putting games on the feed part of the business or even running their own game store. I mean, for a while, they were thinking of running in parallel a kind of games arena where they could have their own little publishing area. And they kind of sailed away from all of that stuff and they just doubled down on their core business, which was direct response advertising. And that was really useful for them in a lot of ways because they really got out of the content business largely. They got a lot of that spam out of the feed. And they made more and more and more money because they created a marketplace for this direct response advertising and they got the publishers, the game publishers, to compete for the best users so they could charge incredibly high prices for them. And as a result, you had this new paradigm that emerged in the casual gaming business, really first on the PC and the web, where people were calculating the lifetime value that they could achieve from keeping these users engaged, and they were weighing that against the customer acquisition costs that they were paying Facebook to acquire those customers in the first place. And then Facebook was optimizing their costs based on the willingness to pay of these publishers. And so you had this virtuous circle if you were Facebook, and maybe not so virtuous circle if you were one of the publishers, getting your customer acquisition costs pressed right up to the edge of your customer lifetime value calculations. It became a strange thing, but the companies that flourished during this era were the ones who had great analytics and who could figure out how to buy this direct response advertising the most efficiently. And so you had this new breed of companies, Machine Zone, Kixeye, Double Down, bunch of others, that really took this analytical approach that Zynga had pioneered in a lot of ways, this data-driven approach, and they extended it to paid customer acquisition on Facebook.
And so Facebook, in a lot of ways, plays this role of creating, the title of this entire episode, the calculus of fun, where they end up creating this almost formulaic way of creating games and targeting, which I think doesn't just stay on online. It obviously starts to move into mobile, I imagine, as well.
Oh, yeah. Mobile, once it became clear that Facebook could have an influence on generating installs for mobile games, finding the mobile whales then becomes the next page in the story. And you can look at it as a blessing or as a curse, but ultimately this analytical approach, it started to influence design because you obviously wanted to design games with these loops that would drive the whales to spend. Those whales were then identified. Facebook knew who they were and they knew what the characteristics of those whales were. And so they could then go and target you new whales or even retarget the existing whales. And they could charge you a premium advertising price in order to get access to those whales. And remember, we're talking about a free-to-play business, and it's important to think about how free-to-play really works in the casual business. And just to take a slight detour, I mean, we're really talking about companies that are monetizing 2 to 5% of their active users. Very small numbers of people actually end up paying in the casual world. And so finding those customers with a willingness to pay, if you can even increase marginally the number of those users who are playing your game, it influences your bottom line in extraordinary ways. And so this competition for whales became extremely hot. And as a result, you had companies that were willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money in order to acquire those whales, right? I mean, I told the story many times of Eastern European developer who's approached me as a venture capitalist to invest money in their company. And they came in showing me that they were on, an $8 million a month or $100 million a year revenue run rate. But their anticipation was that they were going to spend 92% of revenue on customer acquisition. So they were eking out this tiny margin on top of this massive advertising spend because that was the nature of the Facebook competitive auction-oriented marketplace for users.
Exactly. And so Facebook introduces this in 2012, let's say. A decade later, we're still seeing this as the dominant way to approach mobile games. And it completely shapes the entire genre of mobile games. And we have most companies, I get pitched mobile games to this day. A lot of them are still pitching the return on ad spend, where they're saying, hey, we are going to make this money. We're going to be able to invest it back directly into the business to acquire even more users, and hoping that they get the return on ad spend calculation correct. It's a real calculus. And obviously now, you and I know that Apple steps in and does some things on the privacy tracking side. What role does that play?
they tried to stay out of the editorial business as much as possible. I mean, they really wanted to have their kind of featured lists and other things like that. But ultimately, all they really offered to the end user in the App Store were these top downloads, top selling, top revenue generated. I don't even remember what they were, but they were basically like 3 lists, right? And they were top 100 lists. Because they didn't allow promotion within the App Store, they wanted absolute control over the experience in a typical Apple-like way where they know better than anyone what the user wants, and therefore they're going to curate the App Store experience in a way that's to the benefit of their users. They really sort of hurt their users in a lot of ways with the way that they rolled out the mobile game portion of the App Store, because by only allowing these top lists, these top 100 lists, they made those overly important in the discovery process. They made those places that you had to go to look for what was good on the phones. And as a result of that, they made manipulating those top lists a high priority for the developers and the publishers. It became a game to the developers and the publishers to spend so that you popped up onto those lists and then maybe generated enough virality and enough organic spending that you could continue to spend on advertising dollars and continue to push your way up those lists, gaining even more users as you got higher and higher as a proxy for quality. And a lot of times these games that were at the tops of the Apple charts were not the best games, but they were the best promoted games. They were the games that had gotten the best push from their paid user advertising. And that was highly, highly unfortunate. And in a lot of ways, I really feel like Apple blew it. Because I think they had an opportunity where, had they at the very beginning allowed promotion in the App Store, allowed paid promotion in the App Store, they could have, first of all, managed it a lot better. They could have created a rule set that would have limited some of the weirder and more horrific dark patterns that ended up emerging over time. And they would have also utterly prevented Facebook from establishing a beachhead in mobile, which Facebook has come to totally rely on over the years. And so we get to the part of the story now where Apple has decided to step on Facebook's air hose with some of their anti-tracking technology that they've implemented in their browsers and in the stores and elsewhere. And because of that anti-tracking technology, they've massively reduced Facebook's ability to get the best users, if you will, the highest spending users, to the publishers. And so that's put pressure on their advertising revenue. And it's also put pressure on the actual game revenue that's being generated by the mobile game publishers. And the beneficiary of all this, I guess, is the end user whose privacy is protected. But in a lot of ways, Apple could have taken this revenue in a much cleaner way early on had they made the decision to allow advertising. Now, there is a scenario in which Apple does return here and decide that they're the only ones who are going to be able to advertise successfully on the platform using data because they're going to do it through an opt-in model or whatever. But I think at this point in the story, they're open to an antitrust complaint that's way more viable than it would have been back in the day.
It's really interesting that mobile gaming in particular gets caught in the crossfire between the Apple and Facebook battle. You ultimately have most mobile gaming publishers, the top ones, all sort of starving because they can't target the whales anymore. And Apple specifically now tries to go into the ads business, or is hinting towards going towards the ads business. I agree. It's going to be really tough for them to make the argument that there isn't antitrust here, especially when they are maintaining the 70-30% cut. And in hindsight, it might have been just a correct business move to say, we aren't going to take a 70-30% cut on purchases. We're going to move into the advertising business.
I think that's precisely correct. And I think it's really important to focus on that, because had they early on allowed advertising, they could have taken a lower cut, right? They could have dramatically reduced the kind of platform fee, because frankly, they weren't doing customer acquisition in the way that the earlier mobile carriers were, right? The mobile operators back in the feature phone era, they were legit doing customer acquisition for you because they were limiting your competitors' access to the phones themselves. That was serious customer acquisition leverage. When you're allowing 2,000 new games onto the platform every month, and you're basically saying, hey, it's a free-for-all, go spend whatever you can to drive users, you're not actually helping. Okay, yeah, you've sold 1 billion iPhones. Great. But in terms of the actual day-to-day of getting users to download games, you're not really helping all that much. Yeah, you're doing a little curation here and there, but that's not what's really driving the downloads. And you've allowed all of that to leak off of the platform. And yet you hang on to this 30% developer fee as if you were generating user acquisition for the companies that were listing with you. And that just is not the case. And so I think they would have been in a much better position to preserve their platform fees had they done in parallel an advertising business that allowed for a degree of customer acquisition. So you didn't have to maintain this fiction that you were actually justifying your 30% fee on the basis of customer acquisition.
It's super interesting to think about, again, from a business perspective, these decisions had real repercussions. And by Apple choosing the top 10 charts or the top charts strategy, it actually starts to create giants in the mobile gaming industry, specifically mobile game developers. What were those early examples?
You really had an era starting around the launch of in-app purchase and extending kind of, into the second decade of the 21st century, where you really had the rise of these super developers. And they had kind of learned the lesson from the web and PC companies like Zynga, like Double Down, like Kixeye, like Machine Zone. And they brought some of those techniques, but largely with better games, onto the mobile platform. And so you had these super developers that arose during that era. You had King.com, you had Supercell, you had Rovio, companies which ended up generating hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in revenue in some cases. Very, very profitable companies emerge giants in this era. And oddly, most of them were from the Nordic countries.
I can make an assumption based off of what we started this episode with. Is it Nordic specifically because of Nokia? Is that a fair assumption?
Nokia really cast a long shadow over that whole industry. I mean, there was a real Nordic bent to the mobile phone industry because of the dominance of Nokia during the feature phone era. But also in parallel, I think you had this very endemic computer entertainment, gaming, and music scene that was known locally as the demo scene in the Nordic countries, really going back to pre-mobile times, that created a whole culture of creativity and casual gaming in those countries. And a lot of the people who ended up being really successful in the Apple era of the mobile phone business really got their start not only in the feature phone business, but even earlier in the demo scene. So they had these parties. The demo scene was really centered around these demo parties where the community would get together and they would create these micro applications, a lot of times very music oriented back in the day. And so many interesting people that we now think of in the video game business, got their start in the demo scene. You had Christoph Balestra, who ran Naughty Dog for a while, a really famous PlayStation developer. He was a scene star. He came out of the demo scene. The Swedish company DICE, which Electronic Arts acquired, they made the Battlefield series. They came out of the demo scene. Jussi Laakkonen, whose game analytics startup was recently acquired by Unity, he came out of the scene. He was like a scene organizer. And there were many, many others. So there was this pool of talent in the Nordic countries who were capable of making these games under the kind of constraints that were necessary to make profitable mobile games, which means low budgets, fast iterative development. And so I think as much as Nokia was an important component of the Nordic dominance of the early mobile era, I think the demo scene played a role.
Is it fair to think of demo scenes almost, or these demos as almost a hackathon? Is that a fair comparison?
They were kind of a combination of a hackathon and a battle of the bands.
Okay. Amazing.
So yeah, out of that, you got King.com in Sweden, which ran a modestly successful browser-based company making match 3 type games, one of which was called Candy Crush. Should sound very familiar if you're familiar with the mobile games business. And they were running it on Facebook and on the web. And in 2012, they decided to bring it to mobile, where of course it blows up. And they go from, $50 million a year annually to nearly $2 billion in 2013. And they ended up public and then acquired by Activision. They were really sort of the epitome of this new market in a lot of ways. Like they had experience in mass market on the web and in casual coming, from the social gaming world originally. And they knew how to do virtual goods monetization. They knew how to do data-driven customer acquisition. And look, when Facebook took them over, They paid $5.9 billion for them in 2016. They were still spending 50% of net revenues on customer acquisition, $1.2 billion annually. They were spending on primarily to places like Facebook. And that's money that leaked off of the platform in a lot of ways, right? That gives you a sense of the scale of this. So they were a really important early player.
It's incredible. It's a perfect example of the self-reinforcing gold mine of they were spending to make sure they were at the top charts of the Apple ecosystem. Apple doesn't get to capture any of that upside other than in-app purchases, whereas Facebook's it's leaking off to them, and they're getting a bulk of that 1.2 billion per year.
And they weren't even the biggest, right? So you had over in Finland, you had Supercell, run by this incredible genius called Ilkka Paninen. And Ilkka, somebody I knew from the early days of Feature Phone. Like, we worked together on some games back in the Jamdat days. And Ilkka starts a company called Supercell, and they start this very successful game design process where they make games in a very iterative and very modern way, testing a lot of these play patterns with the same kind of analytical rigor and scrutiny that had been applied to customer acquisition and advertising. And they come up with really important games like Heyday and then ultimately Clash of Clans. And Clash of Clans becomes a monster hit. And one of the things that's most impressive about Ilkka has been his ability not just make a single hit, but to make hit after hit after hit.
Yeah, we've talked about Supercell offline a few times, and my favorite part about that story is you always say Ilkka told me he was going to be amazing at killing games, and it turns out he truly was exceptional at killing games. And when we say killing games, he's not just killing duds that fall flat. He goes through an extremely rigorous process where some of these games, by all definitions, would be successful, but they don't meet the bar of Supercell. And that to me is so magical. And it continues to be this magical thing where they continue to, when a game gets released globally, it truly is an absolute hit.
Again, a lot of developers pay lip service to that. I've heard pitch after pitch in my day of developers who've come in and said, oh, we're really good at evaluating our early prototypes and deciding which ones to throw money at. And most of them aren't, but Ilkka really was. And I think obviously the numbers really tell the story. I mean, that company ended up getting, I think SoftBank bought 51% of it in 2013 for like $3 billion. And then Tencent bought out SoftBank and bought a controlling interest in Supercell in 2016 at a $10 billion overall valuation. So roughly equivalent to the terminal valuation of Riot.
Yeah, it's incredible because Supercell also pioneered new genres. The thing that I really admire about Supercell is they embraced a medium. They were one of the first major game developers that actually embraced the medium of mobile, and they pioneered an entirely new genre.
Yeah, the midcore.
Yes.
Which, found a real home on mobile and has been an incredibly successful genre. That was really Ilkka's brainchild. We talked a little bit about King. We talked a little bit about Supercell. Both of those companies had really embraced this modern model of free-to-play, virtual goods monetization, in-app purchase, customer acquisition, data analytics, like all the stuff we've talked about in this episode. They were really just poster children for running a company that way. But there was another company that was around in that early period that's kind of worth talking about because they chose a different path and it didn't really end up well. And so, it's useful to sometimes look at the counterexample when you're seeing why these companies worked, why some of the other ones didn't. I don't always love to talk about these kinds of stories, but I think it's really important to talk about Rovio.
I can only assume that you're referring to Angry Birds, just because as a kid, that was the mobile game that I always thought of as that was the iPhone game.
So Rovio was a company that was started again in Finland, in Helsinki, by a group of students who were active in the demo scene. They had made a bunch of feature phone games back, in my era of mobile. And finally, they came up with this smartphone game, really their magnum opus, which was this game called Angry Birds. Everyone's played this game. They know what it is. It's got that incredible slingshot mechanic that worked perfectly on the touchscreen and a really cute set of bird characters and the pig enemies. And it had a puzzle game kind of quality to it where you had to figure out how to throw the rocks in a way where you would knock out the pillars of the structures and collapse them on top of these hapless pigs. And it was a ton of fun. It was just a tremendously wonderful, whimsical game that was perfectly designed for the device that it was meant to be played on. But they decided that it was a one-time purchase instead of a free-to-play game with in-app purchase. And ultimately, while it did pretty well, it never really got to the level of success that the Clash of Clans games, the Heydays, the Candy Crush Saga games really got to from the likes of King and the likes of Supercell. The Rovio guys also kind of misunderstood the nature of their success, I think. When they came to pitch me on investing in the company in 2010, they tried to sell me on the idea that they were going to be the next Walt Disney Company, that they had invented these characters who were the equivalent of, Mickey Mouse and Steamboat Willie, that they were going to go license them all over the place. They were going to make films. They were going to make bed sheets. They were going to put them on Coca-Cola bottles and the like. And I was gobsmacked when I took this meeting because, look, I came from that world. I worked at the Walt Disney Company. I knew what the revenue opportunities were. The video game business is a way better business than being in the entertainment licensing business. In the entertainment licensing business, yeah, you're getting 8% royalties on some bed sheets. In the meantime, Supercell is raking in the cash with, selling virtual goods that have no cost associated with them, no marginal cost, like just selling them like candy to people who are downloading this game around the world. And so they chose the wrong business. Ironically, they ended up making some good movies, right? Like the Angry Birds movies and the TV show that they ended up greenlighting turned out to be way better than anyone had any right to expect. And they actually I think the Angry Birds movie grossed like $500 million, which is really meaningful, like on a worldwide basis. But their cut of it was nothing compared to what it would have been had they just invested in continuing to make better and better games, even if they were games with these existing characters. So they got themselves into a bit of a pickle. And by 2014, they were in real trouble. They ended up firing a bunch of their staff. They were trading at just a couple $100 million market cap on the exchange, the Finnish exchange. They never managed to get their NASDAQ IPO. And while they've had a little bit of a revival in subsequent years, they've never, ever really gotten back into the driver's seat in the way that they had back in the early days of mobile. And I think it's a very clear example of the business model overwhelming the creativity.
It's a cautionary tale of mobile moves a lot faster than almost any of the other platforms that we talk about on this podcast. And mobile just completely turned into a free-to-play playground. And that dominated and it continues to dominate the entire business of mobile gaming. And trying to make a true venture scale business off of a premium game on mobile is just almost an impossible feat.
Yeah, you should talk a little bit about the hyper-casual business because I'm less familiar with that. That's kind of happened later on in this. And in some ways, it's the demon spawn of all of the stuff that we've been talking about in this episode. And they've taken a lot of these concepts and they've just taken them to their extreme.
Yeah, I mean, hyper-casual, if you look at the top charts on your phone today of top free, it is exactly the repercussions of Apple deciding to promote via the top charts. And what these hyper-casual game developers do is they have indie game developers apply to be published through their network. And when they're published through their network, they actually just cross-promote. They know that the half-life of their games is only going to be a week, 2 weeks of people actually playing through it. But all they care about is pushing them to the next game. And that is why you see, if you look at any given point, Voodoo or some of the others probably dominates 20 of the top 50 games at any given time on top free.
It's truly remarkable. So that's where we've come to, and we've gotten here through some very interesting means. I mean, when you think about where this story starts with Bob Westmoreland at Walmart greenlighting Deer Hunter, and it flows through Nokia's Snake and through Jamdat's early attempts to kind of create a mobile game platform company, and then on to the iPhone and the role of Facebook and their advertising platform and how it's played a role in all of this and the like. It's just an incredibly complicated and interesting story about this evolution of mobile gaming. And I'm sure it's going to continue to get more complicated and evolve further in the future. While we've talked about a lot of things that are maybe a little nefarious and maybe not from a gamer's perspective, sort of the best result, I do think there is a silver lining here. And that is that the customer acquisition, customer lifetime value model that all of these companies pray to like a god, it has two components, right? I mean, there's the customer acquisition component, but there's also the lifetime value component. And the lifetime value component is really centered around the concept of engagement, because you don't generate lifetime value unless you generate engagement. So while there's a lot of bad that's flowed from this hyper concentration on getting pushed up the charts and dark monetization patterns, dark customer acquisition patterns, there's also a good part of this. And that is that games have gotten better, and better games have gotten rewarded as a result, because those are the games that are generating the higher lifetime values, the higher levels of engagement. And so we're going to come back in our next episode when we talk about the forever games, and we're going to talk about how that happened and how some of these games that have been able to create engagement over long periods of time, like decades even, how that happened and what the attributes of those long duration games are and what those play patterns are, and kind of the redemptive story of free to play and customer acquisition.